The golden elevator doors hissed open, and four of the most expensive specialists in Seoul scrambled out like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The lead surgeon, a man whose hands usually never trembled, was sweating through his silk suit, his eyes wide and unfocused. Behind him, a trauma specialist was frantically scrubbing at a speck of blood on her sleeve, whispering that the man in the penthouse was no longer human. They had been hired to save the dragon of the Kwak syndicate, but they had lasted less than an hour before the darkness of the room and the lethal silence of the patient broke them. They ran past the armed sentries, leaving their medical cases behind, choosing their lives over a paycheck they could buy a small island. Amara Okoro watched them go from the shadow of the marble pillar. Her expression is still as stone. She didn't have the luxury of fear. In her worn bag was a final notice from a predatory debt collection agency, a $200,000 weight left behind by a brother who had died in a hospital bed she couldn't afford to pay for. To the fleeing elites, this was a terrifying assignment. To Amara, it was the only way to keep the roof over her head from being torn away. She stepped out into the center of the lobby, her sensible, scuffed shoes clicking against the polished floor. The guards shifted, their hands moving toward their holstered weapons as they tracked the tall, dark-skinned woman with the defiant gaze. Amara didn't flinch. She had spent a lifetime being the only person in the room who looked like her, and she had spent the last 3 years being the only person in the room who wouldn't stop fighting. Min-ho, the head of security, stepped into her path. He was a man built of scars and cynical weariness. He looked at Amara's faded coat and the tired set of her shoulders, then at the empty elevator where the experts had just fled. "You're the replacement?" he asked, his voice flat. 23 people have tried to nurse Ji-Hoon Kwak in the last 6 months. Most didn't make it to the second shift. What makes you think you're different? Amara adjusted the strap of her bag, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made the guard hesitate. "Those doctors were afraid of losing their reputations," she said quietly. "I'm only afraid of losing the one thing I have left, and since I've already buried my heart, there's nothing your boss can do to me that life hasn't done already." Min-ho stared at her for a long beat, seeing the nothing left to lose armor she wore like a second skin. Without another word, he stepped aside and gestured toward the elevator. "Top floor," he muttered. "Try not to scream. It agitates him." Amara stepped into the gold-plated cage. As the doors closed, she looked at her reflection in the mirror, a woman who had been to hell and back, now ascending to meet the devil himself. The elevator doors hissed open onto the penthouse level, a floor of cold obsidian and suffocating silence. Min-ho gestured toward a set of reinforced steel doors at the end of a corridor that felt like a throat closing. With a final, pitying glance, he swiped a keycard and stepped back. Amara didn't wait. She pushed through the heavy doors and entered the bunker. The room was a vacuum of light. Heavy blackout curtains, velvet and thick as armor, sealed every window. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood, the sharp bite of antiseptic, and the stale, smoky scent of expensive whiskey. It was the smell of a man who had decided to rot before he was actually dead. 30 seconds. The voice came from the shadows, low, gravelly, and vibrating with a lethality that made the air feel thin. Amara's eyes adjusted, catching the faint orange glow of a dying fire in the hearth. Seated in a high-backed leather chair was Ji-Hoon Kwak. His silhouette was sharp, his shoulders broad even as he slumped with exhaustion. He was shirtless, his pale torso crisscrossed by a map of jagged silver scars. But it was the angry purple-black swelling on his right shoulder that drew her eye. The infection was weeping through a messy amateur bandage. 25 seconds, Ji-Hoon rasped, his eyes blacker than the room locking onto hers, "before I have you thrown from the roof." Amara didn't speak. She didn't retreat. She dropped her worn medical bag on a glass table with a deliberate thud and walked straight into his personal radius. The temperature of the room was too high, a testament to his mounting fever. "15, he hissed, his hand tightening over the arm of his chair, muscles rippling like a coiled snake. Amara reached out. Before he could react, her cool, dark fingers pressed firmly against his burning wrist. She looked at her watch, her face a mask of clinical indifference. 10, he growled, his body tensing for a strike. "What are you doing, woman?" "Counting," Amara said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "Your pulse is 112, tachycardic. Your skin is clammy, and you're radiating heat like a furnace. You aren't a devil right now, Mr. Kwak. You're just a man about 10 hours away from septic shock." She let go of his wrist and looked him dead in the eye, refusing to flinch at the predator's gaze. "Your 30 seconds are up. You can throw me off the roof, but I'd advise waiting until I change that foul-smelling dressing, unless, of course, the great Korean dragon wants his legacy to be a death by a dirty bandage." For the first time in months, the room grew even quieter. Ji-Hoon leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face and the terrifying deep-set scars on his chest. He looked at her like she was a new species of prey, one that didn't know how to run. "You have a lot of nerve," Amara countered, opening her bag. "Unlike the 23 cowards before me, I'm not afraid of a man who's too proud to admit he hurts." The following morning, a heavy manila envelope was slid under Amara's door at precisely 5 o'clock. Inside was a 50-page document titled The Code of Absolute Conduct. It was less a medical contract and more a manual for a ghost. Rule number 1, no light. Rule number 4, no eye contact exceeding 3 seconds. Rule number 12, communication is limited to 10 words per hour. And most importantly, rule number 15, the patient is to be served only cold, flavorless nourishment to avoid sensory aggravation. Amara sat on the edge of her bed, reading the absurd demands in the dim light of a single lamp. She reached the final page, where Ji-Hoon's signature sat, bold, jagged, and aggressive. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a dry, rasping laugh. Ji-Hoon wasn't protecting his senses. He was trying to turn his penthouse into a tomb so he could rehearse being dead. At noon, Amara bypassed the sterile, cold salads prepared by the estate's chef. Instead, she moved into the kitchen, ignoring the wide-eyed stares of the armed guards as she pulled a pot from the rack. She spent an hour simmering yukjagang, a traditional Korean spicy beef soup, rich with red chili, garlic, and scallions. The aroma was aggressive, vibrant, and undeniably alive. She pushed open the heavy steel doors of the bunker, the steam from the bowl rising like a challenge. The room was, as always, a frozen void of shadows. Ji-Hoon was at his desk, his silhouette a sharp blade against the faint glow of the hearth. "Rule 15, he rasped, his voice cutting through the dark like a wire. "Cold, flavorless, you are already in violation, nurse." Amara didn't stop. She walked directly into the forbidden radius and set the steaming bowl on his desk, exactly where his code of silence lay. The spicy, savory scent filled the air, violently clashing with the smell of whiskey and decay. "You've spent 3 months eating ice and silence, Mr. Kwak. Your blood pressure is bottoming out, and your body can't fight an infection on an empty tank." Ji-Hoon stood, his towering frame casting a shadow that swallowed her whole. He looked down at the vibrant red broth as if it were poison. "You ordered silence. You ordered distance. And I ordered a patient who survives his first week," Amara countered, meeting his black eyes for a full, defiant 5 seconds. She broke rule number 4 without blinking. "The soup is hot, it's spicy, and it's exactly what my grandmother used to wake up a spirit that's trying to sleep itself into a grave. Eat it, or I'll start reading rule number 22, the one about loud, constant chatter out loud." Ji-Hoon's jaw tightened. A muscle leaped in his pale cheek. He looked at the soup, then at the woman who refused to be a ghost. For a heartbeat, The dragon looked less like a monster and more like a man who had forgotten that heat could exist without burning him. The following afternoon, the scent of the spicy soup still lingered in the air, a ghost of defiance that seemed to agitate the shadows. Ji-Hoon sat by the hearth, the firelight dancing across the jagged silver lines that mapped his chest. He watched Amara as she knelt to organize her medical supplies, his gaze lingering on her worn-out shoes and the frayed hem of her trousers. "How much?" he asked, his voice a low, mocking rasp. "How much for what, Mr. Kwak?" "To buy your dignity," he sneered, gesturing vaguely at her faded clothes. "You walk into this house acting like a queen, but you smell of public buses and cheap detergent. You aren't here for mercy, nurse. You're a scavenger picking at the scraps of a dying man's fortune. Is the debt so heavy that you'd let a monster crush you for a few won?" Amara paused, a roll of medical tape gripped in her hand. She finally looked at him, not with the anger he expected, but with a terrifying, hollow calm. She stood slowly, walking toward him until she was inches away from his chair, invading the space no one else dared to enter. "You think your money makes you dangerous. You think these scars on your chest are the only ones that matter because they came from blades and bullets. But look at me, Ji-Hoon." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a thin, faint line of white scar tissue encircling her wrist, and pointed to the hard, unreadable depths of her own eyes. "I didn't get my scars from a Mafia war. I got mine from holding my brother's hand while the machines keeping him alive were turned off because I couldn't pay for another hour. I got mine from sleeping in a car in the dead of winter because a landlord decided my grief wasn't profitable." She leaned down, her face close to his, the firelight reflecting the absolute lack of fear in her gaze. "You try to mock my poverty as if it's a weakness, but it's my armor. You can't take anything from a woman who has already stood in the rain and watched the only world she loved burn to ash. Your power, your guns, your threats, they're just noise to me. I've lived through the end of the world, Mr. Kwak. What could you possibly do to me that's worse than that?" Ji-Hoon's sneer faltered, his jaw tightening as the silence in the room shifted. For the first time, he didn't see a servant or a scavenger. He saw a reflection. He saw the same bone-deep exhaustion, the same radical indifference to survival. He looked at her wrist, then back to her eyes, and for a fleeting second, the dragon of Seoul looked remarkably small. "Now," Amara said, her voice returning to its clinical, steady tone as she reached for his bandage. "Sit back. We have an infection to treat, and I'm not letting you die until I've earned every cent of that money you're so proud of." The shadows in the penthouse seemed to thicken as the clock struck midnight on the third day. The air, once merely heavy, now felt viscous with the heat radiating from Ji-Hoon's body. The sepsis had finally made its move, surging through his veins in a desperate attempt to claim the dragon. He was no longer a silent king on a leather throne. He was a man thrashing against the sheets, his skin a terrifying shade of ashen gray, slicked with a cold, sickly sweat. Amara didn't call for the guards. She knew that if Min-ho saw his boss this vulnerable, the internal politics of the syndicate might turn lethal. Instead, she stripped off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and prepared for a 48-hour war. She moved with the rhythmic precision of a combat medic, alternating between ice-cold compresses to shock his nervous system and high-dose antibiotics delivered through a steady hand. "Hana." The name broke from Ji-Hoon's lips like a sob. It wasn't the command of a Mafia boss, but the raw, bleeding cry of a boy lost in a storm. He grabbed Amara's wrist, his grip so tight his knuckles turned white, his eyes wide and vacant as they stared into a past she couldn't see. "Hana, wait, don't go into the car, please. I'm sorry. I should have checked. I should have known." Amara froze. She didn't know who Hana was, but she knew the weight of that apology. It was the sound of a soul begging for a forgiveness that the grave couldn't grant. It was the same sound she had made into the silence of her brother's empty bedroom. "I'm here," Amara whispered, leaning over him. She didn't pull her wrist away, even as his grip began to bruise her skin. She used her free hand to brush the damp hair from his forehead, her touch firm and grounding. "I've got you, Ji-Hoon. You aren't in that car. You're here. Breathe with me." For 2 days and 2 nights, the room remained a sanctuary of whispered prayers and clinking medical instruments. Amara didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She lived on caffeine and the sheer, stubborn refusal to let another person she cared for slip into the lightless void. She watched the way his scars rippled with every labored breath, realizing that the jagged lines on his skin were nothing compared to the shredded remains of his heart. By the dawn of the 2nd day, the fever finally snapped. The violent shivering subsided into a deep, exhausted stillness. Ji-Hoon's eyes fluttered open, clear for the first time in 48 hours. He looked up and saw Amara still sitting there, her dark eyes bloodshot and heavy with exhaustion, her hand still locked in his. He saw the basin of melted ice, the empty vials of medicine, and the woman who had stood guard at the gates of his hell. He didn't pull away. He didn't mock her. He simply watched her, the silence between them no longer a weapon, but a bridge. He knew then that the 23 who came before her had feared his death, but this woman was the only one who had dared to stay and fight it. The silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels against obsidian floors. The doors to the bunkers swung open, admitting a gust of expensive perfume and a woman who looked like she had stepped off a runway in Milan. This was Park So-hee, the daughter of a rival syndicate and the woman who had once been destined to sit on the Kwak throne. She was draped in white silk that shimmered like ice, her porcelain face a masterpiece of calculated indifference. Behind her, Min-ho and the guards stood tense, unable to block a woman of her status. So-hee didn't glance at them. Her eyes went straight to Ji-Hoon, who remained seated in his chair, his face hardening into a mask of granite. Then her gaze shifted to Amara. The contempt was instantaneous. "So, the rumors are true," So-hee said, her voice like velvet stretched over wire. "You've replaced your medical board with a servant from the streets. Tell me, Ji-Hoon, is this part of your penance, to have someone who smells of the ward and the gutter touching the Kwak legacy?" She walked toward Ji-Hoon, reaching out a gloved hand to tilt his chin upward, as if inspecting a piece of damaged furniture. "My father is losing patience. A dragon who hides in the dark is no longer a dragon. He is a liability. I've come to take you back to the clinic in Jeju. We will fix your reputation, scrub away the last few months, and forget this little lapse in judgment." Amara stepped forward, her shadow falling over the princess. She didn't raise her voice, but the clinical coldness in her tone stopped So-hee's hand mid-air. "The patient is in the middle of a delicate recovery phase, Miss Park. Your presence is a cardiovascular stressor he doesn't need. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." So-hee laughed, a high, brittle sound. "You ask me? You are a hired hand, a temporary fix for a broken man. You see a title, a throne, and a paycheck. I see my property." "No," Amara countered, stepping into the space between them, her dark eyes flashing with a protective fire that silenced the room. "You see a throne, you see a political alliance and a bloodline. You see the dragon, but I'm the only one in this room looking at a man who hasn't slept in 3 days because he's haunted by a car he couldn't stop. I'm the only one seeing a human being who is bleeding under those bandages while you worry about his reputation. To you, he's a crown. To me, he's a patient who is hurting. And in this room, the nurse outranks the princess." Ji-Hoon watched Amara's back, his breath hitching.
For years he had been a chess piece, a weapon, or a god. No one had ever defended his humanity. No one had ever stood between him and the world simply because he was a man who deserved peace. As So-hee retreated in stunned fury, Ji-Hoon realized the fever hadn't just broken his illness. Amara had broken his solitude. Late that evening, while Amara was catching a rare hour of sleep in the staff quarters, Ji-Hoon sat in the amber glow of his computer monitors. His infection had receded, leaving his mind sharp and dangerous. He had signaled Min-ho to bring him the file, the real one, not the nursing credentials, but the financial shadow that followed Amara Okoro across the ocean. On the screen, the numbers were a cold, suffocating weight. $212,400. It was a predatory sum, an accumulation of interest and hospital fees that had metastasized long after her brother's heart had stopped beating. Ji-Hoon scrolled through the records of her payments, tiny, desperate amounts sent every month, the price of her meals, her clothes, and her youth, all poured into a bottomless pit. He looked at the digital final notice highlighted in red. To the world, this was a life sentence. To Ji-Hoon, it was the cost of a single watch sitting on his dresser. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. A few keystrokes later, the red warnings vanished, replaced by a sterile green confirmation. Balance settled. When Amara entered the penthouse the next morning, she found Ji-Hoon standing by the window. The heavy curtains had been pulled back just a few inches, allowing a blade of morning light to cut across his face. He held a tablet in his hand, which he slid across the desk toward her. Amara looked down. Her breath caught as she saw the zeroed-out balance of her debt. The crushing weight she had carried for 3 years was gone in a flash of electronic light. Her hands trembled, and she looked up at him, her eyes searching his for a trace of the mercy she had once preached. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't ask for your charity, Ji-Hoon." "It isn't charity," he said, his voice like grinding stones. He stepped closer, his shadows stretching over her. "It's a purchase. I've seen the way you look at the door every time you think I'm healing. You think you can just walk back into the world and find another tragedy to fix." He stopped inches from her, his presence overwhelming the small space between them. "That debt was the only thing keeping you tethered to a life outside these walls. Now, you don't belong to the banks. You don't belong to the creditors." He reached out, his fingers grazing the cuff of her sleeve, his touch a possessive, heavy heat. "I've paid the fee, Amara. You're the only person who hasn't looked at me and seen a monster or a paycheck. You saw a man. And now that I've seen myself through your eyes, I'm not letting you go. You stay here, not as a nurse, but as mine." Amara stared at the screen, then at the man who had just bought her freedom, only to use it as a cage. The debt was gone, but a new, far more dangerous bond had been forged in the dark. The rain drummed against the reinforced glass of the penthouse, a rhythmic pulse that underscored the electric tension humming through the room. Ji-Hoon was not in his chair. He stood by the hearth, the dying embers casting a deep copper light over the topography of his back. For weeks, Amara had treated his wounds through the narrow lens of a medic, focusing only on the inflammation and the fever. Tonight, the air had shifted. "You've spent so much time cleaning the new wound," Ji-Hoon said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards. "But you never asked about the others." He turned slowly, and for the first time, he didn't pull the shadows around him like a cloak. He stood fully in the light, revealing the jagged history written into his skin. There was a long, ropey line across his ribs from a blade in Busan, a starburst of puckered flesh on his hip from a bullet in Seoul, and most hauntingly, a series of faint, irregular marks near his heart that looked like they had been made by something far more personal than a weapon. Amara stepped closer, her breath hitching. She didn't reach for her gloves or her antiseptic. Her hands stayed bare. "I didn't think you wanted me to see the man who survived them," she whispered. Touch them, he commanded, though it sounded less like an order and more like a plea. Amara hesitated, then lifted her hand. Her dark skin was a stark, beautiful contrast against his pale, scarred chest. When her fingertips finally made contact with the silver line over his heart, it wasn't the clinical touch of a nurse assessing a patient. It was slow, reverent, and heavy with an unspoken understanding. She felt his heart hammer against her palm, a wild, trapped thing, and she realized he was just as terrified of this closeness as she was. Her fingers traced the jagged edges, her touch lingering on the sensitive tissue. Ji-Hoon let out a sharp, ragged breath, his eyes closing as he leaned into her hand. The air between them grew thick, saturated with the scent of wood smoke and a sudden, undeniable hunger. This wasn't about medicine anymore. It was about the recognition of two people who had both been broken by the world, and now finding a strange, forbidden symmetry in the dark. Ji-Hoon's hand came up, his large, calloused fingers covering hers, pinning her palm against his chest. He looked down at her, his black eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. Everyone else sees the dragon, but you touch the scars and don't turn away. In that moment, the debt, the mafia, and the rules of the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his skin, the weight of her touch, and the terrifying realization that they were no longer just nurse and patient. They were two souls standing on the edge of a precipice, and neither was ready to pull back.
The peace of the penthouse was shattered by a percussive thud that vibrated through the obsidian floor, followed by the high-pitched shriek of the security alarms. The red emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the room in a rhythmic, bloody pulse. The rival clan had not come for a negotiation. They had come to decapitate the Kwak syndicate, while its dragon was still perceived to be weak. Gunfire erupted in the corridor, a staccato rhythm of lead against steel that grew closer with every passing second. Ji-Hoon was moving before the smoke even cleared. The lethargy of his recovery vanished, replaced by the fluid, terrifying precision of a man born to war. He grabbed Amara's arm, pulling her behind the heavy marble desk. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Do not move until I tell you." The reinforced steel doors buckled and flew inward. 3 men in tactical gear surged through the opening, their muzzles flashing in the dark. Ji-Hoon didn't flinch. He met them in the center of the room, a whirlwind of silver steel and raw fury. Even wounded, he moved with a grace that was monstrous, disarming the first man and using him as a shield before delivering a lethal strike to the second. In the chaos, a 4th man, a shadow within the shadows, slipped along the perimeter. Amara saw the glint of a long, serrated blade as he lunged toward her hiding spot. She scrambled back, but the desk corner trapped her. "Ji-Hoon!" she screamed. He turned, his eyes widening with a terror that no bullet had ever managed to instill in him. He was too far to shoot, too late to block. Without a heartbeat of hesitation, Ji-Hoon threw himself across the space, his broad back arching as he shielded Amara's body with his own. The blade sank deep into his uninjured shoulder, the sound of tearing flesh sickeningly audible. Ji-Hoon let out a low, guttural snarl, spinning to snap the attacker's neck with a single brutal twist before collapsing onto his knees. Amara scrambled to him, her hands instantly covered in the hot, visceral reality of his blood. "Ji-Hoon, no! Look at me!" He slumped against her, his pale face pressed into her neck, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. The red snowfall of the emergency lights made the world look like it was bleeding. "I told you," he whispered, his voice fading but fiercely clear. "I wouldn't let them take you. I spent my life in the dark, Amara, but you are the only thing that's real." "Don't you dare leave me!" she sobbed, pressing her hands against the wound, her tears mixing with the red on his skin. "I love you, you idiot! I didn't survive everything else just to lose you now!" Ji-Hoon reached up, his blood-stained fingers grazing her cheek. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. "Then I suppose I have to stay. I love you, Amara." As the sirens grew louder and the backup arrived,
The dragon held on to his nurse, finally finding his reason to fight for a tomorrow he had once tried to escape. The morning sun over Seoul was no longer a stranger to the top floor of the Kwak Tower. The heavy velvet curtains had been replaced by floor-to-ceiling glass, allowing the light to wash over the obsidian floors that had once felt like a tomb. Ji-Hoon stood before the window, adjusting the cuffs of a tailored charcoal suit. The jagged scars on his chest were hidden beneath fine silk, and the lethal tension that had once defined his every movement had smoothed into a quiet, grounded authority. He was no longer the dragon hiding in a bunker. He was a chairman standing in the light. A soft reflection appeared in the glass beside him. Amara walked into the room, her presence as calming and steady as it had been on the first day she dared to take his pulse. She wore a dress of deep emerald, her hair styled in an elegant crown that commanded the room. She looked at the man who had once tried to count down the seconds of her life and saw only the man who had given her a reason to start her own again. "The board is waiting, Ji-Hoon," she said, her voice a warm anchor, "and the streets are already lined with people for the opening." He turned, his black eyes softening as they locked onto hers. He reached out, his fingers tracing the small scar on her forehead, a permanent reminder of the night they nearly lost everything. "They aren't waiting for a chairman," he murmured, his hands sliding down to clasp hers, their dark and pale skin a beautiful, final symmetry. "They're waiting for the promise you made me keep." An hour later, they stood before a gleaming 3-story facility in the heart of a district once ravaged by syndicate wars. The bronze plaque near the entrance caught the sun, bearing the name the Okoro Kwak Foundation for Community Health. It was a monument to 2 brothers, one who had died in a hospital bed he couldn't afford, and one who had died in a car he couldn't stop. As the rhythm was cut, the crowd erupted into applause, a sound that would have once agitated Ji-Hoon's predatory instincts. But as he looked out at the faces of the families, people who would never have to choose between their dignity and their lives, he felt the last of the ice in his chest finally melt away. Amara leaned into his side, her head resting against his shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. Ji-Hoon looked down at her, and for the first time since he was a boy, the devil did something the world thought impossible. His lips curved upward, a genuine, radiant smile that reached the sharp corners of his eyes. It wasn't the grin of a victor, but the peace of a man who was finally, truly home. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her temple, his voice a promise whispered into the wind. "No, Amara, we did it."